The station was called Meridian Cross, and it sat at the edge of neutral space, the way a referee sits between two fighters who have agreed to a pause but not a stop. Varric had never been to Meridian Cross before. He had seen it in reports and tactical maps and briefing documents, the kind that showed up when something important was about to happen. It existed because everyone needed somewhere to do things that could not be done anywhere else, and neutrality was the price of admission. The shuttle came in through the main approach corridor. Varric sat at the window and looked out. The first thing he saw was Port 7, and the ship docked in Port 7. He had studied the file on the journey over. Human warship destroyer class. Active commission for 22 years. Current crew 417. Current mission status diplomatic. Detachment voluntarily docked at Meridian Cross pending completion of the Galactic Council scan request. The file had numbers and classifications and a neat organizational structure. It had not prepared him for the actual ship. The ISV Dauntless was big, not the biggest thing Varric had ever seen. Veth battle cruisers ran twice its length, and Solon dreadnoughts made it look modest by comparison, but there was something about its size that had nothing to do with the number. There was a presence to it, a density, like the ship had been built with the specific intention of taking up space in a way that would not be dismissed. The hull was gray, dark, industrial gray with no color markings, no decorative lines, no aesthetic coding, no family symbols or rank indicators in the design, just gray and the work the gray was doing. And across all of that gray, scars. He pressed closer to the window, scars everywhere. Not the light surface scoring that any ship picked up in service. These were real scars, deep ones, patches of hull that did not quite match the surface around them, put in by someone who needed the job done rather than someone who had time to make it invisible. Weld lines thick enough to see from the shuttle running across sections where the original plating had been blown away or burned away, and new metal had been laid over what was gone. Long stretches of the port side where the plating was clearly newer than its surroundings. Different shade of gray, different texture, different manufacture date, if his eye was reading it correctly, and those stretched repair sections had their own repairs inside them, older damage layered under newer damage, layered under more repairs, the history of everything that had ever hit this ship written directly onto its skin. He had seen damaged warships before, every military vessel accumulated wear, but those ships had been repaired in proper docks by crews with time to make the damage invisible. The Dauntless had been repaired by people who had other things to worry about. The repairs were honest, in the way that a scar is honest. They said something hit us here and we fixed it, and we went back and something hit us here again and we fixed it again, and we went back again. His assistant Sola appeared at his shoulder. She was 12 cycles younger than him and had the compound eyes of someone who had not yet learned to filter her reactions. The file said some hull wear, she said. Yes, the file undersold it. Files often do. She was quiet for a moment. How many cycles do you think on that port section alone? He had been trying to count the overlapping repair generations made it difficult. More than 8, he said, possibly more than 11. She made a sound under her breath that was not appropriate for formal company. Commander Dreth materialized behind them. He was the military observer the council had attached to the team. Not a scientist yet, but the kind of soldier who had seen enough to know what mattered without needing to measure it. He looked at the Dauntless for exactly 4 seconds. "It's still flying," he said. "Yes," Varric agreed, "that's the relevant detail." Dreth walked to the back of the shuttle to check the scanning equipment. Varric kept watching the ship. He thought about what he knew of humanity. They had appeared 60 years ago at the edge of the galactic frontier. First contact had gone smoothly enough. Humans were communicative, capable of negotiation, willing to participate in the long diplomatic process the council required. They traded, they talked. They had a sense of humor that other species found confusing but not unpleasant. They had also in those 60 years fought 7 wars. 2 of those they had started. 5 had been initiated by other species that had looked at humanity and made a decision. Manageable, they had thought, useful, perhaps as a resource or simply in the way. Decisions made after brief assessments of humanity's size and an apparent strength relative to their own. 3 of those species no longer controlled the territory they had held. Before their war with humanity, 1 had been reduced to a single occupied system, a civilizational ruin, negotiating survival terms. The 5th had survived with most of its holdings intact, but it had learned something in the process that no intelligence briefing could have taught it. Learned it in the permanent, visceral way that you only learn things when the cost of not knowing them has already been paid. The council had watched all of this. The council always watched, and what it saw across 60 years and 7 conflicts was something it could not fully account for. In its standard frameworks, humanity was not the strongest species it had encountered, not the most advanced, not the most numerous, not the most ancient. Their technology was impressive, but not supreme. Their fleets were capable, but not overwhelming, and they kept winning. And the species that fought them kept making the same error of judgment. The Keth ambassador, 300 years old, never wrong in a threat assessment in living memory, had come before the full council 2 months ago and made a simple request. She wanted a neutral science team to conduct a full scan of a human warship, not their newest, not their most advanced, any standard vessel. Whatever the humans were willing to offer. She had said only, "We need to understand what we are dealing with." The council had forwarded the request to humanity diplomatically, carefully framed as a routine procedure for new member species, which it was not, and everyone knew it was not. Humanity had said yes without negotiation, without conditions. The human diplomatic representative had read the request and had, according to the translation team's record, smiled and said, "Pick any ship you like, we are happy to let you look." Varric had been thinking about that smile. Now for 2 months, he still was not sure what it meant. Looking at the Dauntless now, scarred and patched and dense with the weight of everything it had survived, he was beginning to think that whatever it meant, it was not small. The external scan began at 900 station time. Equipment was the best available: deep resonance hull analyzers, thermal mapping arrays, structural composition readers, the kind that could tell you exactly what a ship was built from and how it was assembled without ever touching it. Varric had used this equipment on 43 alien vessels across 30 Years of survey work, he knew what it showed and he knew what to do with what it showed. The hull composition data arrived first. He read it. Again. He called Saul over and pointed at the screen, and she read it, and her second set of hands went still, which was her version of being very quiet. The hull of the Dauntless was built in 5 distinct layers. The outermost was an impact ablative ceramic composite. It was designed to absorb kinetic strikes by sacrificing itself, burning away in a controlled pattern, dispersing the energy of impact across its surface. You lost the layer to save everything behind it. Expensive, heavy, effective. Behind that was a flex metal weave. It was designed to catch what the ceramic missed and spread the remaining force across a wider surface area rather than allowing it to concentrate and punch through. Behind that was a rigid structural frame, the primary load-bearing skeleton of the hull, built to handle the distributed forces transferred from the flex weave above it. Behind that was a thermal-resistant polymer interior lining, protecting the crew and internal systems from heat transfer through the outer layers, and threaded through the structural frame, almost invisible in the initial scan, because it was integrated so completely into the surrounding material, was a 5th layer, a magnetic shielding mesh, woven through the frame itself, designed to deflect and reduce the effectiveness of directed energy weapons. 5 layers, each doing a different job, each compensating for exactly the weaknesses the others left it behind. Solo looked at the data for a long moment. This is not a whole, she said. This is 5 different arguments against dying. Varric thought that was probably the most precise technical summary possible. He ran the weight calculations. 5 layers made the hull significantly heavier than standard for a ship this size and class. It made the Dauntless slower and less maneuverable, and considerably more expensive to build and power and maintain. Any practical military engineering committee handed this design would have looked at the performance trade-offs and removed 2 of the layers. The math was obvious. You gain more from speed and agility than you kept from the extra armor. Humans had not removed any of the layers. Humans had, in fact, added 1 after the original design was complete. The magnetic mesh showed slightly different bonding chemistry and manufacturing tolerances from the layers around it, which meant it had been integrated. Later something had happened. Something had shown them that 4 layers were not sufficient, and so a 5th had been added. He looked back at the whole scar data. The port section, 11 repair cycles in 1 run of plating. Whatever had been hitting this ship through 5 layers of hull armor, hard enough and often enough to need 11 full panel replacements in a single section, had still not been enough. He saved the hull data to the primary file, marked it priority review, and moved on. The weapons' hard points were next. The weapons themselves were secured and inactive. The Council agreement required that, but the external housings were fully visible too. The scanners, solar in the count, while Varric handled the angle of fire analysis. A Veth destroyer of the same mass and rough dimensions carried 28 external weapon hard points. The Dauntless carried 46, 60% more, not more powerful weapons, not necessarily better weapons, just more of them, more angles of fire, more coverage, more options remaining if 8 or 10 or 12 of them were destroyed mid-engagement. He thought about the word redundancy and what it revealed about how you expected your battles to go. Commander Dreth appeared at his shoulder and looked at the hard point count. He stood with it for a while. Do you know what we call a ship built this way? He said finally. No, Solar said. Refusal. He said it flatly as a technical term rather than an opinion. It is the design philosophy of a species that has decided it will not run out of ways to fight back. He walked away again. The scan ran for 4 more hours. Varric worked through each section, methodically flagging every anomaly, and the flagged file grew longer than any he had generated in 30 years of survey work. The engine output was above rated capacity for the class, upgraded probably more than once. The sensor array at the bow was larger than the original design specifications indicated, extended outward at some point to gain additional detection range. The point defense grid, the rapid fire close-in systems meant to kill incoming missiles and debris, was twice as dense as any non-capital ship he had ever scanned. Everything said more armor, more weapons, more sensors, more output. Each edition carried a cost in weight or fuel or complexity or money, or all 4. Humans had paid every cost and added more anyway. When the scan was complete, Varric stood at the observation window and looked at the Dauntless One. Final time, 43 ships in his survey database. This was the 44th. He had reduced extraordinary things to data. Before, he had measured things that at first seemed incomprehensible and found the numbers behind them and turned the numbers into reports that other people could act on. He was having trouble finding the right frame for this one. It was not about the numbers themselves. Other species had multi-layer hulls. Other species had loaded their ships with weapons. The individual choices were notable but not impossible. It was the philosophy behind every choice, the same idea expressed again and again in every system and every design decision, and every expensive, heavy, operationally inconvenient addition to the ship. We expect this to go badly. We have prepared for how badly it will go. We have prepared for the ways we have not predicted yet. We intend to still be here when it is over. He picked up his data pad. Behind him through the observation glass, the Dauntless sat silent in the docking cradle. The crew had watched them the entire day. He had checked 3 of the port cameras, had shifted angle during the scan, tracking the team's movement, watching them look. They had not come out, had not said anything, had not interfered in any way. Just watched. He followed Sendrath to the briefing room. Tomorrow they would go inside. He was not sure it was going to make the picture clearer. He suspected it was going to make it considerably larger. They went in the next morning. The airlock was the first lesson. It was human-sized, taller and wider than Veth standard, with heavy locking mechanisms on both the inner and outer doors, heavy enough that you noticed the weight of them when they moved. Every seal had a secondary seal behind it. Every electronic lock had a manual override handle mounted beside it, a physical lever that operated on a completely separate mechanism. No power required. 2 systems to do one job, different designs, different failure modes. If one stopped working, the other still worked. He noted it in his log and followed Sola and Dreth into the ship. The main corridor stretched ahead of them, running the length of the vessels. Central spine, low ceilings by Veth. Standard built for human proportions, with thick conduit bundles running overhead and down both walls. Power lines, data lines, pressurization systems, all of it visible rather than hidden, accessible rather than sealed away. Every junction box along the corridor had a manual release. Every door they passed had both an electronic panel and a physical handle. Every 20 m or so, there was a sealed locker mounted to the wall, painted in bright color codes he did not yet know the meaning of. He opened one inside. Oxygen supply, 2 different sizes. Emergency pressure patch materials. Basic tools, a manual hole breach kit, with instructions printed directly onto the inside of the locker door in multiple languages, including Veth. Standard, an emergency kit in every corridor. Every 20 m he closed it and kept walking. They started with the weapons bay. There were 6 primary weapon stations on the main deck level, each one accessed through a reinforced door with. He was not surprised anymore. Both electronic and manual locks. Inside, the weapon systems were larger and more complex than the external hardpoints had suggested. The hardpoints were delivery mechanisms. The rooms behind them were the full architecture of how the weapons were loaded, powered, aimed, and fired. He had expected alien technology to feel alien, cold, and difficult to understand, like walking through the logic of a different mind. The weapons bay felt completely familiar, not in their specifics but in their intention. Every component was exposed and accessible. Nothing was sealed away behind panels that required special tools to open. Service points were labeled in large clear text. Every station had 2 power inputs, one from the main grid, one from an independent secondary line routed from a separate section of the ship entirely. If the main power was cut, the weapon stayed online. The targeting systems had 3 independent processing units, each capable of running the full targeting function alone. All 3 ran simultaneously under normal conditions, cross-checking each other. If one failed, the other 2 continued without interruption. If 2 failed, the third continued. You had to destroy all 3 to take the targeting system offline. 3 independent processors for 1 targeting function. Varrock was beginning to understand the pattern, but what stopped him entirely, long enough that Sola had had to step around him, was what was mounted directly to each weapon station, not nearby, directly to it, bolted to the side of every station at arm's reach from the operator's seat. A sealed kit, bright yellow with a list printed on its face. Damage assessment, tools, replacement components for the most commonly destroyed parts of the station. 2 different types of field repair adhesive, a manual fire control interface that bypassed all the electronics and allowed the weapon to be aimed and fired with nothing but mechanical linkage and physical input. Every station assumed it would take a hit. Every station was equipped to keep working after the hit. He stood in front of one of these kits and thought about the philosophy required to attach it to every station on the ship. You had to have fought in enough situations where stations had taken hits and still needed to keep firing. You had to have learned that the hit was coming, not maybe, not sometimes, but inevitably, and that when it came, the operator sitting there would need to fix things with what was at hand and keep going. You had to have paid in some way for the version of this Lesson that came before you installed the kits. He photographed the kit and moved on. The engineering section was in the middle of the ship, occupying 3 full deck levels, the mechanical heart of everything. Varric had studied human ship engineering in the briefing files and thought he had understood the broad outline in the room itself. The broad outline dissolved into something considerably more involved. The Dauntless ran on 3 separate power generation systems, the main drive, a fusion plant running at the heart of the engineering section, primary power for everything, standard configuration, comparable to VETH equivalents, well, maintained and currently running at around 70% capacity, as would be expected from a docked vessel. Behind the main drive, physically separated from it by 2 reinforced bulkheads, was the first backup, a different type of power plant entirely, a different design, philosophy, different fuel system, different maintenance requirements, not simply a second copy of the first, completely independent approach to the same problem, so that whatever failure mode took out the main drive was unlikely to take out the backup at the same time. Behind that, in a third isolated section, was a second backup, smaller than the first, less output but capable of running life support, basic navigation, communication systems, and minimal propulsion for an extended period entirely on its own. And behind all of this, and Varric almost missed it, because it was so thoroughly integrated into the structural walls that it barely registered as a separate system, was a battery bank, not a small emergency reserve, a full battery system capable of maintaining life support and core systems for 72 hours with no active power generation at all. 72 hours, a crew of 417 people kept alive for 3 days by batteries alone while they figured out what to do next. He looked at the engineering officer assigned to the room during the scan, a young human who had been politely silent but clearly present the entire time, watching the team work with an expression that gave nothing away. What do you call this? Varric asked, gesturing at the battery system. Internally, what is it called? The human thought about it for a moment. Keeping the lights on, he said. Varric wrote that in his notes. Keeping the lights on, 3 backup systems in a 72-hour battery reserve, designed by a species that had at some point been very far from help and very close to losing everything, and had decided to make sure that never happened again, or if it did happen, that it was harder to finish them off than the enemy expected. He thought about the 11 repair cycles in the port hull section. He thought about the weapon stations with their field repair kits bolted to the arm. He thought something taught them all of this, something they paid for. He kept working. The medical bay was on deck 4, accessible from both the main corridor and a secondary access route that ran through the interior of the ship, a route that avoided all the areas most likely to be damaged in a hull strike. He noticed the routing. He noted it. Inside the bay was larger than it should have been. Medical spaces on a military vessel are sized by formula. Crew count, mission profile, expected casualty rate. Veth doctrine gave a destroyer-class vessel of this crew size roughly 400 square meters of medical space. The Dauntless medical bay was nearly 700, large enough to run 3 simultaneous surgical procedures and still have space for triages and recovery. The operating tables were bolted to the floor. Each one had restraint points, straps, and locks built into the structure of the table itself, capable of holding a human body in place under significant G-force or violent maneuvering. The overhead lighting was triple redundant. The equipment had independent power supply from the main bay systems. The supply cabinets were labeled and organized with an efficiency that told him this space was used regularly, and that the people using it needed to find things fast and not think about where they were. Sola was already at the data terminal, working through the medical logs with the access the council agreement had granted. Verax, she said. Something in her voice made him come immediately. She showed him the screen. The Dauntless had run 47 serious trauma procedures in the past 2 years. Not minor injuries, not standard illness, serious trauma cases that on Veth vessels would have required immediate evacuation to a full medical station for any chance of survival. 47 cases treated here in this bay on a ship that was in many of those instances still engaged or immediately post engagement. The survival rate was recorded at the top of the log, 91%. He stood with that number for a while. 91% survival on serious trauma cases treated in a combat environment on a mid-class destroyer by a medical team working in a room with restraint straps on the operating tables because the ship was still maneuvering when they were working. Dreth had come over to look. He read the survival rate and was quiet for a long moment. They're medics, he said. Finally, how are they trained? Varek checked the crew manifest, which the data access included. The lead medical officer had 31 years of service. The 2 assistant surgeons had 15 and 19 years, respectively. A long time, he said. They've done this before, Dreth said. It was not a question. Many times. Dreth looked at the restraint straps on the nearest operating table. He looked at the independent power supply and the triple redundant lighting and the secondary access route that kept the medical bay reachable even if the main corridor was compromised. They designed this room, he said slowly, knowing they would be using it while the ship was still in a fight. Yes, not after. During. The data is consistent with that. Dreth absorbed this. He was a military man. He had commanded ships. He understood what it meant to design a medical bay for active combat conditions, what it said about how you expected your engagements to go and how long you expected them to last. He walked to the far end of the bay and stood looking at the recovery beds. There, 12 of them currently empty, made up with clean material waiting. They expect to take people here from the bridge and the weapons bays and the engine room, he said. Patch them up and send them back. Varek thought about the field repair kits bolted to the weapon stations, the manual overrides beside every door, the 72-hour battery bank in engineering, not just surviving after the fight, surviving through the fight, keeping as many people functional as possible for as long as the fight lasted, because they had learned at a cost, always at a cost, that the fight lasted longer than you thought it would. Yes, he said, that is exactly what this room is for. Solo was still at the data terminal. She had scrolled past the trauma cases to something else in the logs. She was very still. What? Varek asked. The injuries, she said. Injury types in the trauma log. She turned the screen so he could see. Most of them are consistent with weapons impacts or structural collapse. Explosive decompression events, heat. Injuries from internal fires, yes, but look at these. She indicated a subset. Of the cases, 11 of them spread across the 2-year period. These are consistent with injuries sustained during manual repair operations under fire, crew members injured while fixing things on the ship while the ship was being hit. He thought about the field repair kits and the manual overrides and the 72-hour batteries. He thought about a species that had built every system to be fixable by one person with basic tools in a damaged environment with no power available. They were not just surviving battles, they were maintaining functionality through them, pulling crew out of medical and back to stations, sending people into damaged sections to do manual repairs while whatever was shooting at them continued to shoot at them. He thought, you only build for this if you know it will happen. You only know it will happen if it has happened. You only survive it happening enough times to learn from it if you are something very particular, something that does not stop. He saved the medical data and closed the terminal. They still had half the ship to scan. The crew quarters, the system's decks, the lower hull sections, the deep structural data that the hull analyzers were still compiling in the background. He looked around the medical bay one more time, the bolted tables, the restraint straps, the 91% survival rate, sitting in the terminal like a quiet, enormous fact. Then he picked up his equipment and moved to the next section. The picture was getting larger as he had thought it would. He was beginning to understand what was in it. The crew quarters were on decks 5 and 6, running along both sides of the ship. Long parallel corridors, doors evenly spaced, each one identical from the outside. The rooms behind them were smaller than Veth standard by a noticeable margin. Functional space, not comfortable space, the kind of allocation that said, we considered what you need and we gave you that and not more. Varric had expected a warship crew's living space to reflect the warship bare operational. The way the gray hull said nothing about the people inside it. He opened the first door and understood immediately that he had been wrong. The walls were covered, not entirely, not in the chaotic way of clutter, but every crew member whose room they entered and the council's data access agreement included full access to all spaces respectfully provided had done something to the walls, small things in most cases, patches of color objects, mounted carefully, arranged with the particular care that people use when the space is small and every inch matters. And photographs, dozens of them. Physical photographs printed and attached directly to the wall surfaces. At eye height, flat fixed images, technology almost comically simple by interstellar standards, and the crew of the Dauntless used it everywhere. The photographs showed people, not landscapes mostly, not places, people. Groups of people in various configurations, some in uniform and some not, all of them looking at the camera with expressions that ranged across the full register of human emotional display, laughing, serious, squinting against a source, or holding things and pointing at things and standing too close together in the way that groups of people do when they are genuinely comfortable, families, friends, the people who are not here. He stood in the fourth room he had entered and looked at a photograph on the wall, 4 humans in outdoor setting, clearly a specific place on a specific day, 2 of them holding something between them while the Other two watched, all of them laughing. Bright light, trees, some kind of body. Of water in the background. He thought about what it meant to carry this on a warship, not decorative, not random. These photographs were chosen with care. Put up with care, maintained with care. They were the first thing a crew member would see getting up, and the last thing. Before lights out, they were the answer, in some form, to the question of what any of this was for. Varrock species had long ago moved past the need for such anchors. Veth compartmentalized the personal and the operational. You did the mission, the rest waited. It was efficient. It was the correct way to manage the psychological demands of long military service. He looked at the photograph for a while longer before moving on. Sola was working ahead of him in the corridor, her expression carefully neutral in the professional way, which meant she was working hard at keeping it that way. The common areas were on the same deck: a mess hall, a recreation space, a small library, terminal room. They went through them methodically, scanning for anything relevant to the technical profile. In the recreation space they found games, physical ones, cards, simple board games, a few things that use small movable components, worn at the edges, used often, shared by a crew of over 400 people across years of deployment, the kind of wear that only comes from hands. In the mess hall there was a long table running the length of the room, and chairs bolted to the floor around it. Bolted again because the ship moved, and sometimes moved hard. And a chair that could slide was a chair that could injure someone. Practical, everything practical. And on the far wall of the mess hall, Varric stopped. Someone had been drawing. The wall was covered, not fully perhaps, 3/4, with a detailed pencil illustration, not printed, not displayed on a screen, hand-drawn directly on the wall surface in what must have been thousands of hours of work accumulated over a very long time. It was a place, landscape, mountains in the background, a river in the middle distance, small buildings along the riverbank, fields around them, a road going somewhere out of frame, done in gray pencil tones with careful attention to depth and light, to the texture of the mountain stone, and the way the river moved, and the shapes of the trees along its bank. He did not know where it was. It was somewhere on Earth. Some crew member had looked at this wall in a mess hall on a warship in deep space and had decided to put their home on it. Not a digital image, not a printed reproduction, their own hands, for however many months it had taken, bringing back a place that was very far away. He stood in front of it for a long time. Sola came and stood beside him. "Whoever did this," she said quietly, "they've been on this ship a long time. Yes, they've been away from that place for a long time." Yes, she was quiet. Then she said, "Does that make it harder or easier putting it on the wall like that?" He did not know. He thought it was probably different for different people, and that whoever had drawn this had worked out the answer for themselves over the months it had taken, and that the answer was visible in the fact that the drawing existed and was finished and was here. He photographed it and moved on. They did not find anything directly relevant to the technical scan in the living quarters. That was expected. They had come here for completeness, for the full profile the council had requested, but he kept the photographs in his memory. He kept the drawing in his memory. He thought they were relevant even if the scan report did not have a category for them. They found the captain's log in the Afternoon access through the ships. Data terminal under the same council. Agreement that covered all. Non-classified records, 22 years of. Entries, some brief, some longer, some clearly written in fatigue, some in the measured tone of someone choosing words. For a record that would outlast the moment, Varric did not read all of it. He searched for the entries around the Dauntless's major recorded engagements, the ones that had left the deepest marks. In the hull data, the first major battle was 8 years ago. He found the entry. Written in the days after, the captain's entry was shorter than he expected for something that by the hull record had been a severe engagement. It read, "We lost 31 today. Engine room. Fire got 12 of them before suppression. Could reach the section, the others we couldn't get to in time. Cellist team tried, there was no path through. I have written 31 letters. I will send them. When we dock, the ship is flyable. We will continue the mission. 31 dead. Letters written for each ship flyable. Continue." Varric read it 3 times. He thought about the brevity of it. He thought about what was not in the entry. No extended account of grief. No dwelling on the detail of it. 31 letters. Written, one for each person who had been alive that morning and was not alive now. And the entry moved forward because the mission moved forward because there was no other direction available. He found the entry from 6 months later when the crew rotation logs showed the ship had returned to home port. It read, "Docked at home port for the first time in 14 months. Most of the crew has family here. I gave everyone 72 hours. It won't be enough. It never is, but it's what we have." Henderson's daughter was born while we were out. He missed it. He got to meet her today, which is something. Not enough, but something. We will reassemble in 72 hours and continue. It won't be enough. It never is, but it's what we have. He saved that entry. He was not sure why, since it had no bearing on the technical scan. He saved it anyway. He kept reading the entries from the second major engagement 4 years ago, when the drive had been destroyed and the ship had run on backup power for 6 days. The captain's entry during day 3 on secondary systems. Morale is holding. The engineering team is the best I've worked with. They've managed to bring one of the auxiliary thrust units partially online, which gives us some movement capability if we need it. Medical situation stable. I have told the crew what I tell them every time. We have done harder things than this. We are going to be fine. I believe this. I would not say it if I did not believe it. I would not say it if I did not believe it. He turned that over in his mind. A captain on the 3rd day of a crisis with a ship running on emergency power deep in space, writing in the log that they only told the crew they would be fine if they actually believed it. Not a performance of confidence, an actual standard they held themselves to. He wondered if it was true. He suspected it was. The log across 22 years had a consistency of voice that spoke of someone who told the truth because they had decided early on that the truth was more useful than comfort. Sola was reading over shoulder. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "I don't think I fully understood what the scan was about until right now." "What do you mean?" "I thought it was about the ship," she said. "The whole layers, the weapons, the engineering." She paused. "It's not about the ship." "No," he agreed. "The ship is what they built. It reflects who built it. The Photographs, she said. Yes, the drawing, yes, they're scared, she said. They're scared and they miss the people in those photographs, and they miss that place on the wall, and they go anyway, and they fight anyway, and they come back to the ship afterward, and they put the ship back together, and they go again. She said it as if saying it helped her understand it, as if it had needed to be said out loud before it became fully real. The technical report will not capture that, she said. No, he agreed, it will not. They finished the crew sections in the late afternoon and moved to the armory, the last space on the scan list before they reached the deep hull analysis. The armory was fully inventoried and accessible, personal weapons for each crew member, sidearms properly maintained and stored, standard military issue, nothing unusual. Beside each personal sidearm was a second weapon, a different type, different mechanism, different use profile, in some cases larger, in some cases smaller, but always different from the first, not a spare of the same weapon, a completely different option. Every crew member had two personal weapons different from each other, so that whatever situation made the first one wrong for the job or impossible to use, the second one was something else. He stood in the armory and thought about the 5-layer hull and the 3 power systems and the 3 targeting processors and the field repair kit bolted to every weapon station. He thought about what kind of species builds redundancy into everything from the capital scale engineering of the drive systems down to the personal kit of every individual crew member. He thought about the 31 letters and the drawing on the mess hall wall and the 91% survival rate, and then he thought about a simpler thing, a thing that had been sitting at the edge of his understanding all day. Humans built for the possibility that everything would go wrong, not because they expected to lose, because they had found that losing was always on the table until the moment it wasn't. And between the moment when losing became possible and the moment when it was decided, there were options. There were always still options. You had to be alive to use them, and you had to have the tools, and you had to have the will to use the tools while everything around you was falling apart. Every design choice he had seen today was a vote for staying in the fight, not winning it cleanly, staying in it at any cost, through any damage, past any reasonable expectation of survival, because at some point in some fight they had not expected to survive. Staying in it had been the thing that turned the outcome. He wrote that down. He did not yet know how to finish the thought, but he wrote it down because it was the truest thing he had understood all day, and he did not want to lose it. Tomorrow they would go deeper. The hull analysis computers had been running the structural data since this morning, building the full picture of the ship's history in its bones, and by morning that data would be ready. He suspected it would be the most difficult part of the scan. He suspected it would also be the most important. He closed his equipment case and went back to the briefing room, and the drawing on the mess hall wall stayed in his mind the whole way. Those mountains, that river, those small buildings along the bank, someone's home crossed light years to sit on a warship wall so that whoever made it would not forget what they were doing this for. He thought he was beginning to understand why the galaxy was afraid. It was not the weapons. Weapons were just metal and physics. It was the fact that there were 417 people on that ship who had photographs on their walls and a drawing in the mess hall and 31 letters in some captain's archive, and they were still here, still flying, still going back out. That was not the behavior of a species that thought it might lose. That was the behavior of a species that had decided it was not going to. The deep structural scan was ready at 700. Varric had been awake since 500, sitting with the preliminary data, not quite reading it because reading it required something he was not fully sure he was prepared to give. He had scanned 43 ships. He had read structural histories before. He knew what he would find in the bones of any ship that had seen real service, stress fractures, repair traces, the physical record of what the vessel had been through. He had never been reluctant to look before. At 700 he opened the full file. The deep scan used resonance imaging to read the structural history of the metal itself, the stress patterns, the thermal signatures, the crystalline changes in the material that recorded at the molecular level every significant load and impact and repair the ship had ever experienced. Other evidence could be cleaned up, painted over, filed away. The bones kept everything. The Dauntless had been in 23 documented engagements across 22 years of service. He started with the whole record for the worst 3. The first significant engagement was 11 years ago. The scan data showed a large, concentrated impact to the starboard forward section, something capital class, a weapon that would have been fired from a ship considerably larger than the Dauntless. The energy signature recorded in the metal was severe. In a clean technical summary, the starboard section was partially destroyed. Emergency bulkheads had deployed to preserve interior pressure. Repair work had followed, but the repair work told the more complete story. The primary support frame in the starboard section had been bent, not cracked, not broken, bent, a permanent deformation of the structure, the kind of damage that could not be fully corrected in field conditions without dismantling and replacing the frame entirely. That would have taken months in a proper dock. So the engineers had not done that. They had reinforced the opposite side, added mass to the port frame to compensate for the compromised starboard, recalculated the stress distribution across the entire midsection, reprogrammed the navigation system to account for the resulting slight asymmetry in how the whole handled thrust and maneuvering forces. The Dauntless flew differently after that engagement than it had before. Different ship in a small but permanent way, bent and adapted and still flying. 11 years of missions afterward. The second major engagement was 4 years ago. Both primary drives destroyed in a single hit. The structural data showed the shock propagation through the frame. From that moment, a wave of force that had traveled through the entire ship, stressing every joint and connection point, the kind of systemic shock that could shake a vessel apart at its weakest points. Nothing had come apart. The engineering team had run on backup power for 6 days. Varric had read the captain's log entry. He thought now about what the structural data was showing him beneath that entry, actual physical record of what the hull had endured and held through 6 days, with the frame stressed at the joint points, with backup systems absorbing the load that the main drives had been handling, with the crew making repair decisions in real time that would determine whether the frame continued to hold. It had held. The third engagement record was harder to read. He found it In the lower hull data, a section in the aft quarters that had experienced not an external impact but an internal one. The thermal signature was distinct, an explosion originating inside the ship. Not outside, high temperature rapid expansion, the kind of signature left by a catastrophic internal system failure. Or a munitions event. What's that? Solo asked. She had been reading the data on a parallel screen. Internal explosion, he said. Aft lower section. 3 years ago, she was quiet for a moment. That would have killed whoever was in that section. Yes, he ran the cross-reference against the medical logs. From that period, 11 entries, 11 trauma cases in the weeks following the recorded event. He did not access the personal details. The council agreement had limits and this was one of them, but the numbers were there. He thought about 11 people in that medical bay with its restraint-strapped operating tables and its 91% survival rate. He thought about all the field repair kits bolted to all the weapon stations. He thought about the people who had used those kits. Deep scan flagged 47 structural anomalies for manual review. He worked through them in order of severity. So, on one screen and Drex occasionally looking over from the doorway at item 31, he stopped. The anomaly was in the lower hull of Deck 7. Not a damage record, a structural feature, an area of the hull that was built differently from its surroundings, thicker walls, different material composition in the framing, heavier conduit routing than the system's map showed any justification for heavy conduit leading outward, multiple directions through the frame. He looked at the structural map. Deck 7 lower section. He cross-referenced the ship's own schematic. The room was labeled in the schematic as damage control secondary station. He looked up the primary damage control stations. They were on decks 3 and 5, clearly marked, fully equipped and documented in the scanned data he had already reviewed. The room on Deck 7 was not a damage control station. He looked at Sola. She had found the same anomaly. We need to go look at it, he said. She nodded once. Deck 7 was the deepest accessible deck below the main engineering section, in the part of the ship where the structural mass was greatest and the operational systems were fewest. The corridors down here were narrower, the lighting more basic, the feel of the space more purely mechanical. The room was the last door on a dead-end corridor. It had 3 locks, an electronic keypad requiring an access code, a physical combination lock beside it, independent of any electronic system, and a biometric panel, a hand reader requiring a specific registered user. 3 locks to enter a room that the ship's schematic called a secondary damage control station. The council's data access did not include physical lock overrides. They could not enter the room. They could scan it from outside with the deep resonance equipment, and Verax set it up while Dreth examined the door locks with the expression of a man working through a calculation. The scan ran for 12 minutes. The results showed him the room's interior and structural detail. The walls were noticeably thicker than the surrounding ship frame, nearly 3 times standard hull thickness, which was more than any operational justification explained. The floor had heavy conduit running through it in a branching pattern leading outward toward the exterior hull in at least 4 directions, reaching toward both the outer hull layers and inward toward the ship's core systems. The conduit was large, larger than any power or data line shown in the ship's official systems map, routed through unofficial pathways in the frame that did not appear on the schematics at all. A panel on the interior wall, the scan showed, was connected to the conduit network. The room itself was largely empty, a space built for a single specific purpose, a purpose that required thick walls and heavy conduit, and a panel and 3 locks to keep anyone from activating it accidentally or without authorization. He ran the conduit material analysis. He cross-referenced the routing pattern and the conduit diameter against known technological profiles. He ran the thermal residue analysis on the conduit material, looking for usage history. He found it. The conduit had been used once, long ago. The thermal residue was old, partially decayed at the molecular level. A small activation, brief, not extending to the full system, controlled enough to produce heat and energy output consistent with a test. He sat with the analysis results for a moment. He said, "Commander Dreth." Dreth came and looked at the screen. "The conduit leads to the outer hull," Varric said. 4 separate exit points spaced around the aft and lower sections of the ship. "Yes," Dreth said. "The panel activates the system." "Yes." The 3 locks prevent activation without authorization or without multiple crew members agreeing, Dreth said quietly. 3 lock types, 3 different mechanisms. Not one person with 3 credentials. 3 separate authorization methods, which in practice would mean 3 separate people or a deliberate protocol. Varric nodded slowly. "Conduit material and the routing pattern are consistent with." "Yes," Dreth said. He did not need the end of the sentence. He had been a military man for 40 years. He knew the pattern. "How much?" he asked. Varric ran the energy output calculation based on the conduit capacity and the spatial routing. He ran it twice, enough to destroy the ship completely, he said, and everything within approximately 50 km. The number sat in the room, and the test, Dreth said. He was looking at the thermal residue data. They verified it worked. "Yes, a long time ago. Before the ship went into active service, most likely." "Of course," Dreth's voice was flat and professional. "You would test it before you needed it." Solo was standing in the corridor outside the room, looking at the door with its 3 locks. Her face was doing the thing again, where she was working at keeping it controlled. "This is a room," she said, "whose only purpose is to kill everyone in range if the crew is about to be captured or the ship is about to be taken. That's one application," Dreth said. "What's the other one?" "The same one." He looked at the door. "If you lose, if there is no other option, if everything else has been tried and the crew is gone and the ship is going to fall into enemy hands, you activate this room and the enemy does not get the ship and does not get what is on it and does not get the satisfaction of having won completely." Solo was quiet for a moment. "That's a suicide device." "No," Dreth said. He said it with a certainty that surprised Varric. "Suicide is giving up. This is the opposite." He looked at the door for another moment. "This room says you have not won. You have won the battle and you will still not have one because we have made sure that winning cost you something. That makes you question whether winning was worth attempting. This room exists to make the enemy think before they start a fight with this ship about what will happen if they succeed." Varric looked at the door. 3 locks thick walls, old test signature in the Conduit, they had built this room before. The ship launched, it had been there. From the beginning, part of the design. Not added after a bad experience. Installed from day one as a statement of intent. We expect to be in situations this bad. We have prepared for those situations if you bring us to that point. This is what happens, he thought. About the 5-layer hull and the 3 power systems and the 3 targeting processors. He thought about the pattern that had been running through every system on this ship for 2 days. Every system assumed the worst case was possible. Every system was prepared for the worst case. Nothing was left unplanned for, not the weapon systems failing, not the engines failing, not the power failing, not the crew being injured faster than they could be replaced, not losing. Even losing had been prepared for. Even losing had a room. The scan report for the room would be accurate and complete and describe in technical terms what the conduit and the panel and the thick walls and the 3 locks meant in terms of destructive capacity. It would not describe what it meant. He thought about the drawing on the mess hall wall, those mountains, that river, those small buildings. Someone had put their home on the wall of a ship that had a room in its basement designed to and everything in 50 km if it came to that. The same ship, the same people who carried photographs of their families and drew their homes from memory. And also before any of that, before they ever set foot on this ship, for the first time made sure there was a room on deck 7 that said, if you make us, we will take you with us. Not cruelty, not bloodlust. He had read too much of the captain's log to believe that preparation, complete, thorough, leave nothing unplanned preparation, right down to the event they most wanted to avoid, because leaving it unplanned would have meant admitting it was unthinkable. And for humanity it was never unthinkable. It was simply another scenario to prepare for. He sealed the scan equipment and stood in the corridor with Sola and Dreth outside the locked door for a moment. None of them spoke. Then Dreth turned and walked back toward the elevator, and they followed him, and the room with 3 locks was left behind them in the dark of deck 7, where it had been sitting for 22 years, waiting for a day that had not come. Waiting, ready. Varric thought that was the word for all of it, really. Ready for anything, for everything, for every bad outcome up to and including the final one, met not with despair but with a plan, with a room, with 3 locks and a test they had run to make sure it worked before they needed it. They went back up to the briefing room. Varric had 47,000 data points, 62 priority flags, and 1 room that had no data point large enough to hold it. Tonight he would try to write the report. He was not entirely sure that language was equal to the task. The station's night cycle dimmed the corridor lights at 2200, and by 2230 the briefing room where Varric sat was the only lit space on their assigned deck. Sola had gone to bed 2 hours ago. Dreth had stayed until midnight and then left without a word, which was his way of saying he had processed everything he intended to process tonight. Varric had been writing for 4 hours. The technical report was finished. It was 46 pages, organized by system, hull, propulsion, weapons, medical, internal architecture, with the data entries cross-referenced and the priority flags linked to their supporting evidence. It was by any standard a thorough and accurate document. It said in precise language and correct numbers, everything that the scan had found. He had read it back to himself and then sat looking at it for a long time. It was true and it was not enough. He opened a second document. He labeled it Supplementary Observations. Personal Assessment. He was not sure the council would accept it as part of the official report. He was not sure he cared. He had been a scientist for 30 years, and this was what the scan had found, and he was going to say it. He began. He wrote, the technology documented in the primary report is not what makes this species dangerous. I want to be clear about that before I write anything else, because the primary report is very good and it is easy to read it and conclude that the concern is about the weapons count or the whole layers or the redundant power systems. He stopped. He thought about the right way to say the next thing. He wrote, other species have better weapons. The Keth carry more firepower per vessel than the Dauntless. Does the Morin have faster drives? Solon have whole technology that makes 5 layers look modest. If you evaluated humanity by any single technical metric and compared them to the most advanced example in the galaxy of that metric, humanity would not come first. And yet, he paused. He deleted. And yet, because it was too small a transition for what came after it, he left a space instead and went on. He wrote, everything I saw during this scan was designed around the same central assumption. The assumption is not we will win. It is not we are the strongest. The assumption expressed in every engineering choice from the whole construction to the room on deck 7 is this is going to be harder and worse than we are planning for, and we are going to be here when it is over. That is not a technological position. That is a philosophical one, and I am not aware, in 30 years of survey work and 43 prior vessel scans, of another species that has embedded a philosophical position so completely into the physical structure of the things they build. He read that paragraph back. He left it. He wrote about the weapons redundancy and what it said about expecting to lose capability in a fight. He wrote about the 3 power systems and the 72-hour battery reserve and the 6 days on backup power, and what the captain had written on day 3. He wrote about the medical bay with its restraint straps and its 91% survival rate on combat trauma. He wrote about the field repair kits attached directly to each weapon station, because the people sitting at those stations had learned that the station might take a hit and the person in it might be injured and still needed to keep the weapon firing. He wrote about the photographs on the walls and the drawing in the mess hall. He wrote, I am including this not because it is operational data, but because it changes the meaning of the operational data. Species that fights because it is engineered for aggression is one kind of problem. A species that fights because it has built systems of care so strong that the thought of losing what it cares for is more motivating than the fear of what it might face. That is a different kind of problem entirely. Humanity knows what it is risking. Every photograph on every wall of the Dauntless's crew quarters says, I know what I might not come back to. They go anyway. The captain's log across 22 years says they go back after every engagement, sometimes damaged, sometimes with 31 letters to write, always with the understanding that there will be more fights and they will go into those. 2. This is not the psychology of a species in denial about danger. It is the psychology of a species that has looked at danger clearly, decided the alternative is worse, and built everything around not being stopped by it. He stopped writing, he looked at what he had written, he thought about the room on Deck 7 and how to describe it. He wrote the most operationally significant finding of this scan is a room on Deck 7, fully described in the technical report. I want to say one thing about it here, that the technical report does not say that room was built before the ship launched. It is not the result of a bad experience. It was not added after a fight that almost went the other way. It was designed and installed and tested as part of the original ship before anyone had ever been hurt on it. They planned for losing before they ever started, not because they expected to lose, because they decided that even losing had to be on their terms, that even the worst case had to cost the enemy something unbearable, that no outcome up to and including the death of the crew was going to give the enemy what they wanted. Cleanly, I have thought about this for many hours. I think it is the most important thing I found on the Dauntless, more important than the whole composition or the weapons count or the survival statistics, because it tells you not just what they are capable of, but what they are willing. The room on Deck 7 says, we have already decided how far we will go. There is no threshold you can push us past that we have not already planned to meet. How do you fight something that has already prepared for every outcome, including its own destruction? He sat back from the screen. The station was very quiet. The corridor outside the briefing room was dark. He wrote the last section. He wrote, I recommend the Council understand humanity not as a threat to be managed, but as an outcome to be avoided. Not because humanity is aggressive. The record does not on full examination support that characterization of their 7 wars. 5 were started by others. They are not a species looking for conflict. They are a species that has decided conflict will not destroy them and has built everything around that decision and has been right enough times to keep building. The species that makes an enemy of humanity does not begin a battle, it begins a reckoning, and reckonings do not end until one side stops being able to insist on them. Humanity has not stopped in 60 years of galactic contact. The Dauntless has been repaired and returned to service after 23 engagements across 22 years, the most recent of which left visible structural asymmetry in the hull frame. It is currently docked at Meridian Cross 417. Crew aboard waiting. I believe the correct strategic posture is do not give them a reason. He saved the document. He attached it to the technical report. He marked both sections as complete. He heard something in the corridor. Footsteps. Solo walked quickly, light compact steps, not Dreth. He had heard Dreth's pattern for 3 days. Now measured and deliberate, these footsteps were different, a longer stride, even unhurried, the step of someone who was comfortable moving through this space. He turned around. Human was standing in the briefing room doorway, tall as humans often were, wearing the same dark gray uniform as the ship with minimal rank markings. A small cluster of indicators on the collar that the briefing files told him meant senior command. The face was older, with the kind of lines that accumulated from years of making decisions between bad options. The eyes were dark and clear and looking directly at him with an expression he had learned to read. Over 3 days of being watched by the Dauntless's cameras, aware of everything, showing nothing extra. Captain Yara Sorrel, she said, ISV. Dauntless, he had not heard her cross the docking tube from the ship. She had come over in the night and walked to this specific room and arrived at the door while he was still there, which was either very good timing or very deliberate navigation through the station. He suspected the latter. You knew we were scanning, he said. Of course, the whole time you watched us. Port cameras, yes. She didn't move from the doorway. Her eyes went to the data pads on the table without coming any closer, not reading them from there, just noting them. How's the report coming? He looked at her for a moment. He said, you let us find the room on Deck 7, I let you find everything. She said it simply without any particular emphasis. Why? She considered the question, not in the way of someone deciding what to say, but in the way of someone who had already decided and was choosing the best way to say it accurately. A weapon you don't know about isn't a deterrent, she said. It's just a surprise. Surprises don't chain decisions ahead of time. They only change decisions after the fact, when it's already too late. He thought about this. You wanted the council to know. I wanted the council to understand. She said it carefully, the distinction. Deliberate, there's a difference. Knowing is just data. Understanding is what you do differently because of the data. And what should we do differently? She looked at him steadily. Nothing. If we're being honest, you haven't done anything that requires a different response. The council hasn't. A brief pause, but there will be a species that reads your report and decides to do something. There always is, and I would like them to understand before they decide what the decision actually means. He thought about the 31 letters, the drawing on the wall, the 6 days on backup power, and the entry that read, would not say it if I did not believe it. He thought about the room on deck 7 with its 3 locks and its old test signature and its conduit reaching through the frame in 4 directions. You are not what other species think you are, he said. We rarely are, she said it without bitterness. We're not the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. We know that. There are species with more ships, better technology, older knowledge. We don't have any illusions about where we stand in that ranking. But he said, she almost smiled, but we've been in this galaxy for 60 years. We've been hit 5 times by species who thought we were manageable. All 5 of them are still here, which tells you something about what we want. We're not trying to destroy anyone. We just made sure that hitting us was the beginning of a very long, very expensive problem. Long enough and expensive enough that it was easier to stop. And the ones that didn't stop, he said quietly, didn't stop. She agreed. He looked at her. He thought about 43 prior ships and 30 years of survey work, and the fact that he had never, not once in that career, found himself reluctant to open the data file. In the morning, he thought about the Keth ambassador who had asked for this scan and who had been in 300 years wrong, perhaps twice. She had said, we need to understand what we are dealing with. He understood now completely. The supplementary section, he said. He gestured at the data pad, the personal assessment, not just the technical report. She looked at the pad. You wrote 1. Yes, good. She said it with a simple certainty. That's the part that matters. Anyone can read numbers. Numbers tell you what something can do. She looked at him directly. The other part tells you what it will do and why. He picked up the data pad. He looked at the completed report, both sections, technical and personal, 46 pages and 11 more, everything the scan had found and everything he had understood from finding it. I'll send it to the council. He said, all of it, that's all I needed to know. She gave him a brief nod, a human gesture he now recognized as something between acknowledgement and respect, minimal and genuine. Thank you for being thorough. A lot of scientists would have stopped at the numbers. She turned from the doorway and walked back down the corridor toward the docking port, toward her ship. He listened to her footsteps until they faded. Then he sat down and sent the report, both sections, every data point, every priority flag, every personal observation, the hull composition and the weapons count and the medical base survival rate and the room on deck 7 and the drawing on the mess hall wall. All of it. He sat back. The briefing room was very quiet. He got up and went to the observation window and looked at the Dauntless one last time. The ship sat in the docking cradle the way it had sat there for 3 days, heavy, scarred gray, patient, lights showing in a few of the port sections. People awake in there, moving around, living their lives on a warship at a neutral station while the galaxy turned and debated what they were and what they meant and whether they were something to fear. He thought, they are not afraid of us, not because they were reckless, not because they didn't understand the threat. He had read 3 days of evidence about how well they understood threats and how thoroughly they prepared for them. They were not afraid of the galaxy the way prey was afraid of predators. They simply were not afraid in the way that stopped you, whatever they felt, whatever caution or concern or awareness they carried, and they carried plenty. The captain's log across 22 years made that clear. It did not stop them. It did not slow them. It went into the design of the hull and the room on deck 7 and the 3 power systems and the field repair kits, and then they went anyway. He thought about the Keth ambassador, 300 years old, the request she had made and the word she had used, understand. He thought he understood. The galaxy had been making the same mistake about humanity for 60 years, not a hostile mistake, not an aggressive one, an understandable one, the kind you made when you looked at something new and evaluated it quickly by size and age and obvious strength, the way you evaluated everything else, manageable. Those 5 species had thought. The scars on the Dauntless answered that. 11 repair cycles in the port section, 23 engagements, 31 letters, 6 days on backup power, a bent frame that flew asymmetrically, now calculated into the navigation system and compensated for still flying, a room on deck 7 that said, even this we have prepared for. Not manageable, never manageable. Something else entirely, something the existing categories did not quite fit. Species that had looked at everything the universe could do to it, and there was evidence in those bones, in that log, of quite a lot of what the universe could do, and had decided, not once but again and again and again across 22 years on the ship alone and 60 years in this galaxy, that it was going to be here when that was over. It was going to fix what was broken and write the letters that needed writing, and give everyone 72 hours, which won't be enough. It never is, but it's what we have, and go back out. Varric stood at the observation window until the station's ambient lighting shifted toward morning cycle. Then he turned off the briefing room light and walked to his quarters. The report was sent. The council would read it. Some of them would read the numbers and understand the numbers and take the numbers as they meaning. Others would read further. Keth ambassador, he suspected, would read all of it, including the supplementary section, and she would nod at certain parts the way you nod when something confirms what you already believed. She had been right to ask for the scan. He hoped the right species read it. He hoped the species that would otherwise have looked at humanity and thought manageable read the supplementary section and understood the room on deck 7 and thought again. He hoped that was enough. Behind him, through the observation window, the ISV Dauntless sat in the cradle and waited, gray and scarred and patient and ready, the way it had always been, the way it would always be, and